Okay, everyone, this is Chapter 6 overview, and Chapter 6 is primarily focused on deviance, although there is some discussion of crime as well. So let's go ahead and get started. First off, we should use a definition so we all agree on what deviance is. For sociologists, deviance is a behavior, a trait, a belief, something that departs from the norm or what is generally accepted in society. And because it is outside of the norm of what's generally accepted, it typically elicits a negative reaction from people in the other group. You know, the group that's the dominant group, or the group that is the one that is the mainstream of what people do. Now, of course, not everything that is deviant is criminal. For example, most people who are married, they would say that when they got married, there was an expectation that they would remain monogamous. However, there are some couples who have what are called open relationships or open marriages. And that means that these are couples who've agreed in their marriage or their relationship to be able to have sexual relationships with other people. Now, keep in mind, it's sexual relationships, not any other kind of relationship, not personal, not intimate, but to be able to just have sex with other people from time to time. And now, again, that is outside the norm because I think most people would say, wow, marriage should be monogamous. But for these individuals, or relationships should be monogamous, but for those couples who choose something different, they are outside the norm, and many people have a negative reaction to what they do. Crime is easier to identify. It's simply the violation of a law, and laws are simply norms that enough of society believed that it was so serious that we should codify it and create a law against it, or a law to do it. All right, so some laws are prescriptive laws and others are proscriptive laws. A prescriptive law tells you what you should do, what you must do, like wear a seatbelt, wear a helmet if you're riding a motorcycle in California, pay your taxes. Those are prescriptive laws. And proscriptive laws are things that tell you what not to do. So don't cheat, don't murder, don't steal, etc. Okay. One thing to keep in mind is that all crimes are deviant behavior, but not all deviant behavior is criminal. Okay. So I want to just go back to that. All crimes are deviant behavior because they violate the values and the norms of the group. However, not all deviance is criminal, because some deviance, as in the case of murder, it hasn't been codified into law. Adultery hasn't been codified into a law. It's not against the law to commit adultery. If it were, there'd be a lot more people in jails and prisons. Okay, so every society has come up with a way to punish people, to let them know when they've done something bad. And sometimes we do it within a group, a smaller group. Sometimes we do it on a more large scale at the societal or the citywide or the countrywide or the statewide or the nationwide level. So in the United States, for the most part, if someone is convicted of a felony crime, then we banish them. You know, we send them off to prison somewhere with all the other bad people just like them. On the other hand, we sometimes in smaller groups, we engage in what is known as informal sanctions, things such as shunning or excluding someone. So perhaps in a friendship group or in a family, somebody does something that the others think is terrible or wrong. And so they either exclude the person completely and say, we no longer want to talk to you, or they just simply shun the other person, meaning they stop inviting that person to get together, stop inviting that person to holiday things, etc. We also sometimes informally, as an informal sanction, we use shaming. So we let everybody else know what bad thing this person did, and it's far easier to do today because of social media, right? Lots of people go onto social media to tell others about the bad thing that someone they know has done. And then stigmatizing. Stigmatizing is when we give a label to someone based upon the bad thing we think they did, and everybody else starts calling that person the same thing, and before you know it, this person doesn't feel comfortable being around all those people because of that negative label. It is important to recognize, excuse me, it is important to recognize that historically, physical punishment was the rule. So rather than having created jails and prisons early on, society simply punished that person physically, sometimes until death, or sometimes they punish the person intending to cause death. So being drawn and quartered, for example, which is a type of punishment in ancient times in which the bad person was tied to 4 horses, 1 limb to each horse, so 1 arm to 2 horses and the 2 feet to 2 other horses. And then these 4 horses would be whipped, and the 4 horses, of course, would take off in different directions. And eventually the person's body would be torn apart by the force of the pulling of the horses. That's known as being drawn and quartered. There's no shortage of very torturous physical punishments that humans came up with and have come up with, continue to come up with, to punish someone that they don't like or that they think has done something bad. All right, so I'm going to focus here on the 3 perspectives, because the 3 perspectives are important in trying to understand how do societies view crime and deviance. And first, functionalist perspective. Remember that functionalist perspective is always focusing on this idea that if something exists, it exists for a reason. That is, if something in a society exists, whatever it is, whether it's culture or a part of culture, tradition, language, values, etc., or it's a social institution, government, education, etc., or in this case, some sort of individual or individuals acting outside the norm, that from a functionalist perspective, there must be a reason for it, right? And so, according to Emile Durkheim, whom I hope you remember from chapter 1, the French sociologist, he believed that society actually could benefit from when someone engages in deviance. So, how might this work? Well, Durkheim argued that deviance can be positive when for this reason, it clarifies the moral boundaries, meaning that when we see someone else get punished for something that they did, that they weren't supposed to do, that reminds us, it clarifies those moral boundaries for us. It reminds us why we are not supposed to do that thing. Also, when we all look at that bad person in a community or in a larger society, we look at that bad person and we feel a sense of cohesion, social cohesion, because we're the good people, right? We don't do bad things like that bad person. And so we can pat ourselves on the back that, yay, we're the good people and that's a bad person, and it's right for that bad person to be punished. I want you to consider an example of this as 9/11. 9/11, September 11th, 2001. Many of you probably weren't born yet, but I'm sure you've heard of what happened. American society, really unified after that happened. Many people, of course, gave money to the Red Cross and other social services organizations that helped people who had survived that terrible experience. And it isn't just those World Trade Towers. Of course, it was a plane that went down, etc. Um, a lot of people joined the military because they wanted to fight for their country, etc. A lot of people began putting flags on their cars, wearing flags on their clothing, putting them outside their homes. There was this whole national feeling that, we wouldn't let terrorists get us down, that we were going to come together as a society and we were going to come back just as good as before. The third thing is that there might even be social change as a result of people engaging in deviance. So what that means, of course, is that if you think about the civil rights movement, again, I know none of us lived through it, not even myself. Well, I was a little kid, so I didn't live in the South either. But if you've seen or read about any accounts of some of what happened in the South, you know that there were some students, many of them college students, others young adults, and others in the community who challenged some of the Jim Crow laws. And one example that was done frequently is throughout the South, in many cities and towns, Black people were not supposed to sit in certain areas in a restaurant. And so what these protesters would do is go into a cafe, sit at the lunch counter that they weren't supposed to be at, or sit in an area of the restaurant that they weren't supposed to be at. And then, of course, whites would typically react in a very negative way because they were violating either the social law or the actual law. And these young individuals, or these individuals who engaged in it, often were called really negative racial epithets. Oftentimes food was thrown at them. Some of them were even beaten, but they did it because they believed that in order to change a law, you have to challenge that law. You have to engage in deviance. And so we saw that was one piece that helped to build into that social change that we saw in 1964 with the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Okay, so let's take a look at a couple theories here. I'm going to start with Travis Hershey's social control theory. What Hershey in his research found was that social bonds are really important in understanding crime. Hershey believed that the stronger a person's social bonds were to what he called conventional others, then the less likely that they would be to engage in deviance. And the reason for that, he believed, is because when we have strong social bonds to what he called conventional others, these are people who typically do what they're supposed to do, right? They pay their bills, they pay their taxes, they go to work every day, they send their kids to school, they're PTA moms and dads, soccer moms and dads, etc. These are people who pretty much do what they're supposed to do. They're the good people. Those people teach us the norms and the values of our society. And because we trust these people, we begin to believe that there's moral validity to what they're teaching us. That is, that it's the right thing to do to follow the norms and values that they're teaching us. Excuse me. Okay, so, excuse me, I want to pause this. Okay, back. He also, though, given his research, he found that the opposite was also true, that people who grew up in social environments where they were not around many conventional others, these were people who tended to have weaker social bonds. And because of those weak social bonds, they didn't really have an ability to learn the norms and the values of their society. And so if you don't learn those from people around you, you're much less likely to believe in the moral validity of those. And then, of course, you're much more likely to engage in deviance. So I'll use myself as an example of how this can work with the weaker social bonds. Um, I grew up in a very dysfunctional family. My parents shoplifted, and they were actually caught doing it. That's how I know that they did it for quite a while before they got caught. And my brother, one of my older brothers, there were 9 of us, I'm number 7. One of my older brothers taught me to steal candy when I was about 4 or 5. And so I knew once I got to school that other people thought stealing was wrong. And I had another brother who stole cars and parted them out. And so I knew other people thought stealing was wrong. And that's what teachers said. That's what I learned in school. I knew other people thought that stealing was wrong. However, the people around me, the people that I was closest to, they didn't believe the same thing. They were not conventional in lots and lots of ways. And so even though I knew other people thought that certain activities were wrong, I didn't believe in the moral validity of those rules. And hence, I continued to do the things that I was doing. And so I engaged in quite a bit of deviance when I was younger. On the other hand, I have some nephews, and they are, well, it's my very best friend, and I think of them as my nephews. They call me Thea, Auntie. They, on the other hand, are much more walking the straight and narrow path. They do not, to my knowledge, really engage in deviance at all. In fact, when the oldest one, who's now, well, he's going to be 19 in August, when he was in first grade or so, I was talking to my friend on the phone. She had dropped him off earlier in the morning, and I was walking him to school because it was just up the street from where I lived, and I didn't have to teach until later in the day. And so I was talking to her, and I mentioned to her that I was thinking about calling in sick because I just felt like I needed a mental health day. And as soon as I hung up, my nephew said to me, Thea, you shouldn't call in sick if you're not really sick. It's wrong to do that. And I was a bit taken aback, a bit surprised by how adamant he was that what I was planning to do was very wrong. And he made me promise that I wouldn't call in sick because I wasn't really sick, and it's bad to tell a lie, he said. So I promised him, and I did go to work that day. But he's got parents who are conventional others, and he's learned those norms and values of society, and he believes in the moral validity. Now, fast forward, I got to college, and I started realizing that none of the other students that I met had the same kind of thinking I did. And so I did eventually stop engaging in deviant behavior while I was in college. But it wasn't until I was surrounded by others and made friends with others who were more conventional, and my social bonds with them were much stronger than with members of my family, because I wasn't really all that close to them. So that's how social control theory, at least in Hershey's view, works, and that's based upon the research that he did. Structural strain theory, and usually people just call it strain theory. This was developed by Robert Merton, and he says some things that are very interesting as well. In his research, what he found was that in our society, there are goals, for material success, right? Things that we're supposed to want. Things such as a nice house, a nice car, a good job, nice clothes, etc. There are all these goals for material success. And what Merton found was that there aren't a whole lot of people who are going to be able to do that, who are going to be able to achieve that level of material success. Because often there just aren't enough legitimate opportunities to do that. So what Merton believed was that those goals are high the opportunities for achieving that goal are low, that presents a gap between what we should achieve and what we actually can. That gap is what creates the stress or the strain, in Merton's words, for people. And so he came up with what he believes to be 5 responses that people respond in various ways to this stress or this strain. And they are outlined here. You see that here is here on the left side are the cultural goals. Here are the institutionalized means, or in other words, the socially acceptable means for achieving success. And these are the 5 different responses. I'm going to start with conformity. Conformists, using the noun here, conformists are people who accept these cultural goals for material success, and they also accept the institutionalized means. That means that these are people who say, I want that stuff, and I'm going to work to get it. And they look at what society says are the acceptable ways to achieve it, and they work toward that. So these are the people who go to school, they do well in school, they try to go to university, and after that, maybe they get a graduate degree or 2 or 3, and then they go into the workforce and they work hard and they try to get promotions, and all the while they are doing all the other things that society says they should do, get a nice house, a nice car, etc. Now, the innovators here, they also accept the goals, the cultural goals for material success. However, they reject the socially acceptable ways. Yeah, they think they can do it their way. Okay? And some of them can. Mark Zuckerberg, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates. These are at least 3 people that I can think of who did not do things the way that they were supposed to. I mention all 3 of them because they're all college dropouts. They all dropped out of college. And they weren't just going to, a state school. These were people who were, Zuckerberg was at Harvard, and Jobs and Steve Jobs and Bill Gates, I believe, were at MIT. These are top-notch schools, and it's difficult to get into them. And yet, they dropped out. I believe all of them dropped out in their 2nd or 3rd year. I'm pretty sure that their parents were not excited and accepting and supportive when each of those 3 individuals said to their parents, hey, I'm dropping out of college because I've got this great idea and I'm going to work on it and I'm going to be really successful. I'm pretty sure their parents were probably pissed. Were probably saying, "What? No, you're not going to do that." I don't think most of you have parents who'd be happy and overjoyed if you decided, hey, I'm going to drop out of school and I'm just going to, make it with this idea I have. I'm going to be very successful. What should they have done? Well, if they were conformists, they would have finished school, maybe obtained a bachelor's or a master's degree or some other postdoctoral degree. Then they would have gone to work for a company and they would have learned all that they could about the thing that they were working on. And then maybe in 5 to 7 years, maybe they could have or should have started their own company or worked on the thing that they believed in. But they didn't do that. They just dropped out and they worked, and eventually they got their creation developed, and they're all very wealthy now. So innovators don't necessarily do anything illegal. They just go against the socially acceptable means. Now, of course, there are people who are innovators who also do illegal things in order to achieve the material success, rob banks or sell drugs or whatever. But not all innovators have done something illegal. They've just done it their own way, the way that society says is wrong. Then, of course, we have ritualism here. This is when people in this category, they reject the cultural goals, but they accept the societal means of achieving those goals. Essentially, here's what they do. They know they're never going to achieve the success that society says they're supposed to. So instead, what they do is they say, you know, I don't need all that stuff. I don't need the big car. I don't need the big house. I don't need the fancy clothes and the jewelry. I don't need any of that stuff. I'm happy with what I have. But they do continue to go to work every day, pay their bills, pay their taxes. Again, this is like middle America. The soccer moms and dads, the PTA moms and dads, these are good people. They support their kids in Little League, etc. You know, but they know I'm never going to get that. And that's okay. I don't want it. I don't even want it. I'm happy with what I have, and I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing. Rituals. They're going through the rituals. Kind of like when people go into a Catholic church. I can say this because I remember growing up and going to Catholic church. There's in the foyer or the vestibule, whatever it's called. There's always this little pot or several pots of water at the entrance, and it's holy water. You're supposed to dip your fingers in it and bless yourself. Most people do it without even having to think about it. They walk in, and if they're really good Catholics, they genuflect, you know, which is they slightly kneel and bless themselves again before sitting down. It's a ritual. We don't even have to think about it. And that's what ritualists do. They're not even really thinking about the fact that they're not going to get all this stuff. They long ago realized that, accepted it, and just keep slugging away. Retreatists. Retreatists reject both the cultural goals for material success and the institutionalized means. So these are people who decide, you know what, I don't want to deal with all that BS. I'm not going to be in the rat race like everybody else. And some of these people even move away out into the country or out into the mountains and pretty much are self-sustaining. Others, you know, may become reclusive because they don't want to deal with all the stuff and the messaging of the larger society. And then there are the rebels, people who decide for themselves, you know, I don't know about all that stuff that society says I should achieve. I'm going to think about what I want. How do I want to live my life? And once I decide what it is that I want and how I want to live my life, then they create their own means of achieving those goals. And so you could think of some people, well, you guys really won't know what the hippies were, so I'll try to use a more recent example. I'll use the example of FIRE, Financially Independent, Retire Early. It's an acronym, and there are quite a few millennials who are part of this movement. In fact, they probably make up the biggest part of this movement, although there are others in other age groups too. But the whole idea for FIRE is you live as frugally as you possibly can, pay off all your debts as quickly as you can, including your house. And of course, that means that for a lot of these people, they downsize. They don't need a huge house. And you live as simply as you can so you can pay off all these things and invest. And invest and invest and invest until you get to a point where you believe, you know what, I don't have to work anymore if I don't want to. A lot of these people continue to work, but they now are doing what they want to do. And so to me, that's a good example of rebels because they've come up with their own goals and achieving it in their own way. All those big fancy cars and big houses, new clothes, etc., is really not that important to them. They would rather live their lives more simply, pay off their debts, and invest and invest and invest so that they can be financially stable. Okay, and that's something a lot of Americans aren't willing to do, I don't think, because we want stuff. And these FIRE rebels, they don't necessarily need stuff or want it. Okay, so now conflict theory. Conflict theory, remember, conflict theorists are focused on who has the power, who's using it, and how is that use of power advantaging the powerful, and how is it disadvantaging those without the power and the resources. So, for conflict theorists, they believe that one of the ways that those with the power and the resources maintain their power is that they create laws that marginalize and criminalize the people who are not like them. So one really good example of this is, well, they're not in place anymore, but, well, no, you know what? I'll use this example because I believe it to be true. You may have heard that some of the southern and other red states, about 14 of them today, have begun to pass or have already passed voting laws that seem to make it much more difficult for people to vote. And here are a couple of the things that are common in these voting laws, more recent ones. It's a misdemeanor for people to give anyone standing in line to vote any water or food. It is no longer, there will no longer be Sunday voting, which, if you do not know, is big voting day for many African American communities, particularly in the South, because when they go to church on Sunday, often the early voting opportunity is there, and after they come out of church, they go right there and they vote, or the church says, okay, everybody, we're going to go over and vote, and they have vans, and everybody goes over and votes at the polling place on a Sunday. But that's illegal now to do that. You can't do that anymore. Making it harder to vote absentee ballot, of course, which means that people who have disabilities or who have work schedules that make it difficult for them to get out there and vote maybe won't vote now. So one has to ask, why are the people who have the power to make these laws, why are they doing this? Why are they creating laws that will disadvantage those very people who we say should be voting? I mean, if we really truly believe in a republic, which is what the United States is, and we believe that it's important for people to be able to participate in their republic, then we should be trying to make it easier for people to vote and not more difficult. So that's one way in which laws can marginalize some people. Criminalizing certain behaviors, I want you to consider how the use of marijuana for at least probably since 1937, Harrison Tax Act, became illegal. And again, largely, who were the users of marijuana? Well, it was African Americans and brown people. And so one has to wonder, well, was the law really designed just to marginalize and criminalize that behavior? Now, of course, there are about 6 or 7 states that do allow marijuana for recreation, but for recreational use. But we also know that if you live in California and go over to Arizona, you cannot use marijuana, or you can, but it's a felony there. So if you cross state lines with your California marijuana into Arizona, then you made it a felony. So again, one has to wonder, why is one state more lenient and the other state is much less lenient? There are a lot of brown people in both states, but the two states are quite different. One is blue and one is red. So anyway, that's conflict theory. Symbolic interactionism. Symbolic interactionism is focused on that idea, remember, that the people that we interact with can influence the way that we interact with others in the group or the way that we think about others. And so symbolic interactionism focuses on this idea that if we're thinking about crime and we're thinking about deviance, that the groups that we're part of, the social environments that we're part of, can either influence us to think of some things as good and some things as bad. And of course, religion plays a role here. If we're part of a religious group, maybe even the religious group influences the way that we think about people who do certain things. So there are 2 theories here, differential association theory and labeling theory. So I'm going to go over differential association theory first. Excuse me. Oh, I've been drinking soda. All right, so symbolic interactionist perspective, just for differential association theory. Edward Sutherland developed this idea in the 50s, I believe it was. And what Sutherland learned from his research, and so his idea is this: we learn deviant behavior from interacting with deviant peers or people who are deviant within our social environments. So here's how Sutherland says it works. If we're around people in our social environments, whether it's at school or our neighborhood friendship groups or the people at home or our religious group or whatever, whoever we're around in these social environments, if they are mostly law-abiding, conventional others, to use the words of Travis Hershey, we're far less likely to engage in deviant behavior than if we're part of a group or social environments where deviant behavior is quite common. And so again, I use myself as an example here because I think differential association theory explains my situation quite well. I was in a family, and there were others who were connected to my family who did illegal things. And so I learned how to do illegal things from the people around me. Now, could I have learned at the age of 4 or 5 how to steal candy on my own? Maybe, but unlikely. I might have learned it a little bit later, maybe from a friend, but I would not have learned how to steal at that young age if I hadn't had a brother who thought it was a good idea to teach me to do that. And the opposite, of course, is true. You know, if you're around people, and you may be one of those persons who's never cheated, who's never stolen, never even taken a piece of candy or a piece of bubble gum without paying for it. You were around people who didn't do bad things, who didn't steal, who were not dysfunctional. And so you learned from them to follow the laws. So that's Sutherland's idea. Labeling theory. Labeling theory by Howard Becker is the idea that the way other people judge us and give us a label can influence the way that we begin to think of ourselves. That is, it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. If a child is told from a young age, you're dumb, you're stupid, you can never do anything right, you're never going to amount to anything, then if you're told that often enough as a child, it's not going to be too long, according to Becker, until you now believe that you are dumb, stupid, never going to amount to anything, etc. It becomes part of how you think of yourself. On the other hand, because it's not all bad, on the other hand, if you are told by people around you that you're smart, you're wonderful, you're capable, you're motivated, you can do whatever you want, as long as you put your mind to it, then you'll begin to believe, I'm smart, I'm strong, I can do whatever I want as long as I put my mind to it. You'll believe all that positive stuff. It'll become part of who you are. That's self-fulfilling prophecy. All right, so stereotype threat is this idea that we have stereotypes in our head about our groups. And those stereotypes can come back forefront to the top of our minds right when we're about to do something really important, like take a test, SAT, for example, or the GMAT or the LSAT or any of those other entrance tests, or a job interview, or a presentation, etc. Right when we're about to do that really important thing, those stereotypes come to mind. And we know that people in our group are viewed as not being quite as capable when it comes to doing the thing you're about to do. This theory says, unfortunately, what tends to happen is that those stereotypes mess up your performance. There is a little video here that I put into the slide. You can take a look at it. It explains a little bit more fully. It's based on Dr. Claude Steele's work, his research when he was at Stanford University in the late 90s. Into the 2000s. But it's a really interesting idea of how knowing that there are negative stereotypes about people who are part of our group can influence our performance in a negative way. So take a look at that. Oh, I didn't
Academy
mean
for Social Change presents
to do that. Okay, here we go. All right, now the opposite of that is stereotype promise. And that's a self-fulfilling prophecy in which positive stereotypes lead to positive performance. So here's an example of this. If you are somebody who knows that members of your group tend to do really well in something, then you will believe in that stereotype and you'll likely perform better simply because you know, hey, I'm expected to do well. Therefore I'm going to do well. Whereas with stereotype threat, without really being aware of it, you start thinking, I know people from my group often aren't great at this, and I don't know now if I can do as well at this as I think I should or as I want to. So two different ends of the spectrum. All right, so I think that's about it that I wanted to talk about. Yep, okay. So that's it, and I'll see you through chapter 7 overview.